somewhere on your notes about some of the irregular verbs that I couldn't quite fit on here. Now, part of the reason why I wanted you to do the midterm review with all those extra boxes is because if you work on just the preterite tense, the preterite side by itself, you'll see lots of different things that are irregular in the preterite. So I'm going to put this up for just a second, but for now you can just drop down eat and sit. Eat and sit are irregular in the preterite. And if you remember, eat and sit are all the fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fueron conjugations. All of those. Whoops. Okay. So you don't have to jot down the box, but if you want to come back and do this midterm review, this is a good place to see a lot of different things that happen in the preterite that we should already know about. So if you want to do this review, you'll have ir, ser, dar, ver, hacer, and leer that we did that were irregular in the preterite, along with a whole bunch of other verbs that we're going to kind of refresh today. Caracterizar verbs, basement verbs, and then just some regular verbs. So you kind of have a combination of all those. So if you want to work on this review and then come and ask me to check answers, that's perfectly fine. But coming back to this, just so you add it and you have it kind of nice in one page, all the things that are irregular in the preterite. Hacer, when we did it, if you remember, it has no accents. Actually, ir, ser, dar, ver, and hacer all have 0 accents in the preterite tense. Leer was the only one that had accents, and then it ended up having extra accents. So, hacer is what we're going to come back to this chapter and refresh. That basically, we're going to do the rest of the chapter of verbs that are similar to hacer. They all have an irregular stem. The whole entire beginning changes. It's not just the basement change like we've talked about. It's not just one letter that changes here and there. It's the whole entire beginning will change. And then the endings will be slightly different because if you remember, hice and hizo, both of those forms where we normally would have accents, are technically AR endings with no accents, and then the rest are ER-IR endings. So it's a combination of endings. Just know for this chapter, when we start talking about the new stuff, hacer is going to be our intro to that, and then all the other verbs will kind of follow along those same pattern, that same family of verbs. Okay. All right, so something else we already know about preterite are stem-changing verbs. When we did that section, we really focused on present tense stem-changing verbs. And then when we looked at that chart that you have, the ODUE, E to IE, and E to I chart, we looked at it from a different perspective, and we looked at it only for IR verbs. And then in the preterite, they changed. In the present tense, they were boot verbs. In the preterite, they became basement changes. Only the bottom 2 changed instead of changing inside the boot shape. And the only 2 types of changes that we had in the preterite and the basement were O to U and E to I. So any of the verbs that we talked about from that chart that were E to IE changes, they became E to I changes. Any of the verbs that were O to UE changes became O to U changes. So present tense, they were boot, and there were different kinds of changes. Preterite, they are only O to U, E to I, only for verbs that end in IR, and they only change on the bottom 2 boxes. You can call it basement or whatever you want to call it. And remember, this is for any verbs that end in IR. IR verbs only. Now, does that mean that every single verb that's an IR verb will be a basement change? No. We have a list of regular verbs that just have regular conjugations. So once we start putting everything we know about preterite, the sections will be labeled a little bit differently. But you have to be able to start distinguishing, oh, I remember this verb. Something weird happened with it. Oh, yeah, it's an IR verb. Maybe a basement verb. Okay? So start thinking about those things. And in this last section, something that we already know, we didn't quite call it a basement verb when we did it the first time, but we ended up with a basement change. If you remember when we talked about the verb leer, I told you that we ended up with 3 vowels in a row on those bottom 2 forms. And so leer changed from I to Y in the bottom 2, and then it ended up with extra accents. Okay. I want you to jot down the definition for these other verbs that will also make I to Y changes. And notice that they are ER verbs and IR verbs. But there are no AR verbs there. So jot down the meanings of these. This is the only new part for today, is that I'm giving you more verbs that fit under the same family and fit the same pattern as leer. So when we conjugate leer, we had leí, regular conjugation, accent on the I. Leíste, with an extra accent on the I. Then leyó had a Y change, L-E-Y, then the O with the accent. Leímos had an extra accent on the I. And leyeron made an I to Y change, and it did not get an accent whatsoever. That same exact thing that we did with the verb leer will happen with any of these other verbs. So I just want you to know that these are other verbs that will follow that same rule. I also want to mention that the 3 vowels in a row rule is not really a rule that exists. You're not really going to see it in any grammar book because the rule doesn't always work. I'm going to show you an exception of when the rule doesn't work. We talked about at the top with cargadas adverbs, QU and GU being a combination letter. You don't hear that U at all. So technically when you see the U with a verb, and then you have 2 vowels that follow it, it will not make the I to Y change. So let me show you an example of what that's going to look like. Everybody okay with these meanings? Back to this if you need to. Let's, again, keep in mind Q, U, and G, U are combination sounds. So if we were to look at the verb esquiar, the verb esquiar has a QU in it. We don't say escuillar. We don't hear that U at all. Esquiar. First thing that we should notice, it's an AR verb. Doesn't make any other changes. So it's a regular conjugation. But for all your other verbs that are like leer, that'll make the I to Y change, and here are your leer conjugations. Leí, leíste, leyó, leímos, leyeron. The 2 form and nosotros form get extra accents. These 2 accents are normally there, and then you make your I to Y changes on the bottom 2 forms, except for I don't have it in a conjugation box here. So the reason why we end up with I to Y verbs, 3 vowels in a row, is that verbs like leer, once you take away the ER or IR, since they're only ER or IR verbs, the verb itself will have a vowel as the last letter of the stem. Everybody follow me so far? And then when you look at your endings have 2 vowels for the ER and IR verbs right here. But if we had a verb whose stem ended in a vowel, then we only have 1 vowel here. So the reason why we end up with 3 vowels in a row is that the stem ends in a vowel, and then the ending has the 2nd and 3rd vowel, 2nd and 3rd vowel. Okay. Why it doesn't happen with esquiar is because esquiar is an AR verb, and the QU and GU, the U doesn't count as a 3 vowel here. So U, I, and E don't count as a vowel change. Plus you know that I to Y changes only happen in the bottom 2. So you're not going to have any stem changes up here. Everybody with me so far? I just wanted to show you an example of the exception to the rule, because it won't always work. Okay, but I do want you to be aware that QU, GU don't work. But for next week, we're going to have everything that we know about preterite, regular preterite, cargadas adverbs, the basements, E to I, O to U, and now I to Y. We're going to put all that together with the new set of verbs that will be, like I said, that are going to be whole stem changing verbs. Okay? So for now, for today, all we're doing is reviewing what we already know so that we're solid with preterite by itself. And then when we come back, we'll start adding, next week, we'll start adding some of our new verbs together to what we already know. So I'm going to take a second just to refresh what you already know about preterite and conjugate these 8 boxes. Nadar, leer, navegar, dormir, abrir, explicar, organizar, and divertirse. I want you to conjugate these boxes so that you'll see some of them will be regular verbs, some will be basement changes, some will be cargarzar, some will be different kinds of basement changes. We have E to I, O to U. We also have I to Y. With I to Y's, you have to worry about extra accents. So take a second to go ahead and practice preterite. Make sure we're solid with preterite. And just as a warning so that we all know, next week when we do a quiz, there will be a section of the quiz where it's going to ask you to change from a present tense conjugation to preterite. We've done things like that. And to your Edmodo, I uploaded page 105, which is one of the exercises we've done in the past. We've gone from singular side of the chart to the plural side of the chart. And then we should also be able to just look at endings of our words. For example, if we're just looking at the ending of this verb, these all happen to be AR verbs. But if you have a O at the end of a conjugated verb, just an O, you know that that's a present tense yo form. If you happen to have an O with an accent, then you should be able to recognize that that is now preterite of the el ello usted form. So you should know how to move from present to preterite, staying with the same subject and knowing what your subject is by the ending of the verb. Okay. So go ahead and practice those boxes, and then we'll go over them, make sure we're okay with preterite, solid with present tense as well.